Welcome everyone to the webinar. This is Note-Taking Strategies for Students. I'm Paul Novak. I'm the founder of Iris Reading, and I want to welcome you to this webinar. Thanks for attending. I think you'll find this helpful, especially if you've got to deal with a lot of technical information. For those of you not already familiar with the work that Iris does, we teach speed reading courses to students and professionals. Of course, part of speed reading and just reading in general is taking notes, and it's incredibly important to take notes, especially if you're dealing with very, very technical information. So let's talk about technical information, because when you're dealing with such detailed information, every so often you're going to have to write down some notes, or maybe you have to take very, very specific notes. But that's not the only challenge with technical information. The other challenge is, sometimes that information might be very dry, and we might easily space out. Has that ever happened to you, where you read like a whole page of text and then you look up and you wonder, well, what did I just read for the past 5 minutes or 10 minutes or more? So first of all, I want you to know that just by taking notes, you can easily improve your focus. That's a very simple way to improve your focus. If you're reading very dry material, try to make sure you're taking notes. We all know, a lot of people know that's important, and yet they still don't take notes. Because notes help you focus, they also help you to remember information more effectively. Obviously, because you could refer back to your notes, but even if you couldn't refer back to your notes, if you had a quiz or a test, just the action of writing something down helps you to remember the information better. I'll give you an example. You ever write down notes and never look at them again? I think we all have. And students and teachers and professors have known this for a while, that sometimes students will write down notes and never look at them again. And they've done studies in the past, and they've done these studies over and over, and it always confirms the same thing. They wanted to know, if you write something down and never look at it, well, what's the point of writing it down to begin with? Does it help you in any way? And the studies show over and over again that just writing, the simple action of writing something down, improves your ability to remember it, even if you never look at it again. Now, obviously, if you look at those notes again and review them, that improves your memory even further, and that's because repetition helps you to remember things. I'll repeat that. Repetition helps you remember. And this is how we learn songs. I'm sure there's a song I could put on right now you haven't heard in years, but you know the lyrics to the song. How's that happen? Repetition. You heard that song many, many times in the past. Maybe when it was popular, you listened to it over and over again. And that's the power of repetition. It really helps us remember things. And note-taking, that's a form of repetition. Now, reading is one form of repetition. You read something, you get that initial exposure, that repetition. You might go to class and listen to a lecture. That's another repetition. Writing things down is another form of repetition, and even reviewing those notes later on. Again, this is all about repetition. But there is a note-taking problem. The problem is taking too many notes or too little notes. There has to be some sort of balance, which leads me, to the question of, when should I take notes? Some people aren't aware. Some people, they spend too much time taking notes. Some people don't take enough time, or they don't take notes at all. It's very important to strategically take notes and to know when. And here's what I suggest. If you're going to be taking notes, you want to follow the 80-20 principle. You may have heard of the 80-20 principle. It applies in a lot of different contexts to productivity. Sometimes they use the 80-20 principle in an economic context. For example, this is sometimes called the Pareto principle. It's named after this Italian mathematician and economist, Wilfredo Pareto. And at the time when he was writing about it, he estimated that 20% of the population in Italy at the time, 20% of them owned 80% of the land. And he found this relationship happening not just in economics and business, but also, he also found it happening just in general among people. A good example might be, think about the clothes that you wear. You might have, 20% of the clothes you own, you wear 80% of the time. Maybe a chapter of reading that you're going through, maybe 20% of that chapter has 80% of the information. Now, when we're talking about the 80-20 principle in respect to note-taking, here's how I want you to think of it. 80% of your time should be spent reading, and 20% of your time, at maximum 20%, should be spent note-taking. Now, what does that break down to in the form of minutes? Let's say you were studying for a whole hour. 80% of an hour, which is 60 minutes, is simply 48 minutes of reading. So if you're studying for an hour, 48 of those minutes you want to spend reading, and 12 minutes at a maximum spent note-taking. So if you feel like you've got an issue of taking notes too often, you want to do this kind of 80-20 principle. Now, exactly 48 minutes of reading and 12 minutes of note taking, you're not going to follow this to the exact second. You can round up if you want. For example, you might say 50 minutes I'm going to spend reading and 10 minutes is going to be spent note taking. This 12 minutes or this 20% is the maximum amount of time you want to spend taking notes if you were to study for, let's say, an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is. So when we're talking about an hour, this is the breakdown. 12 minutes max. Here's what I like to do and what I suggest you do as well. Follow a 25-5 strategy. What this 25-5 strategy means is you would read for 25 minutes and then you would take notes for 5 minutes. And then you just simply repeat the process. Now, why are we doing 25 and 5? First of all, remember what we said earlier here, 48 minutes and 12? Well, if you wanted to round and just make it simpler on yourself, 25 minutes right here times 2 is 50 minutes, right? So that's 50 minutes. If you multiply this number by 2, that's 10 minutes. So this equates to an hour. If you were spending an hour, you'd be doing 25 minutes, then 5. And then you repeat 25 minutes and 5. That would be an hour of study time. And that way, if you're spending 5 minutes of note taking or reviewing your notes, you're making sure that you're not doing excessively. I've run into students before where they spend an hour reading and 30 minutes out of that hour, half of the time is spent just taking notes. So we want to make sure that we're making progress through the material, hence the reason why we should be spending, 80% of our time reading here. So we're pushing through the material. And of course, if you're reading technical information and you need to remember it well, you want to make sure you're taking some notes, but you don't want to do it excessively. So try doing this kind of a process. And this is actually based on some research. This 25 minutes, this actually has to do with kind of the tipping point of human focus. Now, we all have different levels of focus, and it's important for us to improve our ability to focus. But what they find, even if you have great abilities to concentrate, after about 25 minutes, your ability to concentrate kind of falls off a cliff. So if you're going to be doing a single thing like reading, you want to shoot for 25 minutes max, and then occupy your mind with something else, like note-taking. This gives your brain the ability to get some much needed rest. In other words, during that 5 minutes, you're no longer reading, you're occupying a different part of your brain by taking notes. And then you go back to reading for 25 minutes and then 5 minutes of note taking. And that's a very efficient way to approach your study time, and also to make sure that you're not taking notes in a way that's unbalanced. Again, you don't want to spend half of your time note taking and half of your time reading. That's just not the best approach when you're studying and trying to move through massive amounts of information. The other question that commonly comes up is, how should I go about taking notes? There's a variety of ways you could take notes, and I want to review some of those and talk about some of the ideal ways to take notes. First of all, let's talk about how not to take notes. This would be a good example. You ever have just pages upon pages of just, chicken scratch, or just, I've got notebooks from when I was in high school. I actually looked at them not too long ago, and just totally unorganized notes, stuff that looks like this. I don't know why I still have these notebooks, but I do. And this is not the most organized way to take notes. There's a variety of ways you could take notes. Some people like to highlight, and nothing's necessarily wrong with highlighting. But again, there's got to be a balance. This would be not too bad, and this is obviously a little crazy, as you can see here. If you've ever bought a used college textbook, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about excessive highlighting. How exactly does excessive highlighting happen? How does it happen? I'll tell you. Let me take an example article here, just for frame of reference. This is just a one-pager. It's called India's Skills Famine. What happens is someone's reading along, and let's say they have to remember this article for a test or a quiz that's coming up, and they read the first sentence, and they read it, and they're like, "Ooh, that's really important. I'm going to highlight that." And then they read the next sentence, and they're like, "You know what? That next sentence is also kind of important. I'm going to highlight that sentence as well." And then they read the next sentence, and they're like, "You know what? That's also a very important detail. I'm going to highlight that as well." And as you can see, this starts becoming a little bit of a mess. You don't want to take notes on a sentence by sentence basis. What I suggest you do, make sure that when you're reading, you finish a paragraph first. And if you feel the need to take a note after that paragraph, wait until you finish the paragraph. Don't, read something in the middle and all of a sudden stop reading at this point right here and say, "You know what, I got to write this down." You want to make sure you complete the thought before highlighting or writing anything down. But again, highlighting is just one way to take notes. Another common option for some students is take notes in the margin. You might have a paragraph where, some people might highlight, some people might write notes in the margin. It's important to know that when you're taking notes in the margin, or just in general, you don't have to write down entire sentences. You could just write down a word or a short phrase that kind of sums it up or reminds you of what that paragraph was about. For example, if we were going back to highlighting, you don't have to highlight entire sentences or paragraphs. You could sometimes just highlight one word or a short phrase, and that'll remind you of what it's about. I'll give you an example. When I say the word Katrina, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? If you're like most people in the US, they would associate Katrina to hurricane. Now, if you know someone named Katrina, you might associate Katrina to that person that you know. But if you had an entire paragraph that was talking about Hurricane Katrina and its effect on the city of New Orleans and all this detailed information, and then another paragraph discusses another topic, you might just highlight Katrina. And then when you review your notes or review your highlighted, pieces of the text, it's easy for you to say, oh yeah, that was that paragraph about Hurricane Katrina and its effect on New Orleans. It'll just pop into your mind very easily. There's no reason to just, highlight entire chunks of text. So keep it brief, keep it concise. Now, another way to take notes, these are just options: highlighting, taking notes in the margin. Some people like taking outlines. Nice thing about outlines is they, structure the information. And if you're reading a lot of textbooks, for example, your information probably is going to be organized into sections. If you have a 40-page chapter, it's going to be, section 1 with, headline and subheadlines and boldface words and so on. And this lends itself to outlines to a certain extent. However, I want you to know that outlines are a very linear way of taking notes. And here's the thing: your mind doesn't operate in a linear fashion. Computer programs, they operate in a linear fashion. They go line of code, they process every line of code one by one very quickly, but your mind doesn't work that way. Your mind works in a very non-linear fashion. And this gives us the thought of taking notes in another way. Another option you might want to consider, which I highly recommend, is mind mapping. Mind mapping is a very powerful way to take notes and a very visual way to take notes. And the nice thing about your brain is you remember visual information much better than linear information. This is very nonlinear. And actually, if you think about it, most topics are nonlinear. When I say nonlinear, I mean not in any specific order. For example, if you take history goes in a specific order, right? World War II should probably come after World War I. But not all topics are like that. Let's take the topic of physics. If you had the word physics in the middle here, you don't necessarily have to create an outline based on it. Physics encompasses a lot of different things here. And the same thing goes, for example, we could talk about Einstein's theories of relativity. We could talk about quantum mechanics. We can talk about Isaac Newton and laws of motion. We could talk about thermodynamics and so on and so forth. Well, there's a lot of things involved with physics. Same thing with the topic of law. If you were studying law, there's constitutional law, there's, intellectual property law, contract law, labor law, not in any specific order. They all just happen to be involved with the topic of law. Now, there are situations where things need to be in a certain order, and that's where outlines might be a better option for you. But when things are nonlinear, such as a topic like law, physics, or maybe even like a topic like business or marketing, those are very nonlinear. And mind mapping lends itself really well. And even if you were creating a mind map for a chapter, if you had to go in a specific order, you could just order this in a clockwise fashion. You see how you can start with your first section here. This might be the first section of the chapter. This might be section 2 with its subsegments. This might be section 3, section 4, section 5. So you can go in a clockwise fashion if you really needed order to go with your mind map. But also, mind maps rely on the ability to be concise. You don't want to have huge sentences in a mind map. Now, if you do like mind mapping, there are a couple of programs that you can use if you like taking notes on your computer. I recommend 2 different types of software. Well, one of them is a software download, xmind.net. There's a free mind mapping program there. And by the way, Iris or myself, we don't get any kind of financial compensation for recommending these programs to you. These are programs that I just use personally. Xmind is a great tool if you want something downloadable on a PC or a Mac. It works on both. And the nice thing is their free version of the software is very robust. Most people won't need their premium version. I've been using the free version for a while, and it's a great program. There's also mindmeister.com. This is web-based. So the difference between these two, both are great programs, but one is something you would download to your computer, and the other is web-based. If you like storing your mind maps in the cloud, you want to share them with other people, collaborate, MindMeister is the tool for you. But if you just want something downloadable, maybe you don't always have an internet connection, that's where I use Xmind. I'll show you an example of each real quick. Let's go over Xmind. When you open up Xmind on a Mac, this is what it looks like. You would put your main topic in the middle, and then you would open up another tab here, and you'd have one topic, another topic, and so on and so forth. Each of these can have subtopics, as you see here. And it's very easy to create these mind maps. And you can make them very, very robust if you absolutely needed to. By the way, the shortcuts that I'm using to make these quickly, I'm just using the tab button on my keyboard to create a brand new topic. And you can move around with the keyboard, up and down arrow keys and left and right. Now, this is MindMeister. Not MindMeister. This is Xmind. Let me show you MindMeister. MindMeister, it looks like this. Here's the home page. This, by the way, they have a free trial, but I believe it's limited to a certain amount of mind maps, or maybe it's only good for a period of time. I use the paid version because we actually use this internally within Iris for collaboration and brainstorming and project planning. Mind maps can be used in a lot of different ways. By the way, we actually have an entire course dedicated to mind mapping if you go to irisreading.com. But if you sign into MindMeister, let me show you real quickly how it looks. The design is actually a little cleaner, looks a little more modern. You create a new mind map here. You can have folders for your mind maps. Of course, you could do the same thing with Xmind. You just create a folder on your computer. There's different templates here. I'm going to create a blank template. And the same idea as before. You've got your new mind map. You put your main idea in the middle or the title of your chapter. You can hit Tab to create a new bubble, or you could hit the plus sign up here. And again, that's where you would put, one topic that you have, another topic, and so on and so forth, as you can see here. Nice thing is you could also move these things around. If this belongs with this, I could just move it over like this. See how that works? And there's all sorts of other functionalities, as you can see, color coding, changing the font, bolding, italicizing, smiley faces, and so on and so forth. Both of these programs, MindMeister and also Xmind, are great tools. So you might want to check them out if you like creating your notes on the computer screen and you find mind mapping to be a viable option. I think mind mapping works really, really well for a lot of students. If you have sequential information like history, I recommend you do outlines. But most other information lends itself very well for mind mapping. And the reason why they call it a mind map is because it reflects the way your mind works a lot more accurately than linear-based notes like this or like this, which all of us have done at some point or another. So try to do a mind map next time you're outlining a chapter in a non-linear fashion. Now, how do you remember information better? I want to go over a strategy that you can utilize that involves note-taking, and it can actually improve your memory of the information that you're reading. It's called the read and recall strategy. It's very simple to implement. All you got to do is take some material that you want to read, and as you're going through the material, all you got to do is simply read a paragraph and then take a quick note. And when I say a quick note, I mean a quick keyword or a phrase. And then just repeat the process. Read a paragraph, take a quick note. Read a paragraph, note. Now, this is somewhat repetitive, but the idea here is you want to get your mind used to the mindset of asking yourself constantly, what is this about? What's going on here? What's the main idea? What are the important details? So at the end of every paragraph that you read, if you take a quick note, think about what happens to your focus. If I know that I have to write something down at the end of a paragraph, I'm probably going to pay a little more attention to that paragraph. Most people, when they're reading, they might just be reading paragraph after paragraph after paragraph, and then their mind wanders off, but they're still, they think they're reading through the material, but they're thinking of something completely different. If you take notes after each paragraph, you'll find yourself much more active. It's a much more active way of reading than just reading and reading and reading and reading and just not thinking about taking any notes. This read and recall strategy is not something you need to do indefinitely. This is an exercise that you would practice to improve your regular ability to remember information. And I recommend you practice doing this 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks. Read a paragraph, take a note. Read a paragraph, take a note. And that's a great way to improve your memory. Now, there are other situations that we have to deal with. And actually, let's do a quick example of how you would do this. If you were creating a mind map, for example, let me bring up this article again. Remember this one pager that I had here? The title is India's Skills Famine. If you were doing this, you would read this whole paragraph here. For example, this first sentence here says, the economic transformation of India is one of the great business stories of our time. And then you would take quick notes. Maybe you have a separate sheet of paper. Let me create a new mind map here. So here's that India's Skills Famine article. So the moment I would read this paragraph, I would stop reading at this point, last word of the sentence, and I might say, okay, first paragraph, economic transformation. And you might be writing this on your computer or you might be writing it just by hand. Either way is fine. And then I go and I read this next paragraph, which begins, but India has run into a surprising hitch on its way to superpower status. Its inexhaustible supply of workers is becoming exhausted. So I might say, okay, this is about a supply of workers. Next paragraph, same thing. How is this possible in a country that every year produces 2.5 million college graduates and 400,000 engineers? Alrighty, so I'm going to put, most interesting thing from there for me was 400,000 engineers. That's a lot of engineers. Next one, you go to the next paragraph, same exact thing. Notice how I could just focus on those first sentences and you can get the main idea. There was a time when many economists believed that post-secondary education didn't have much impact on economic growth. Interesting. I'm going to put education and economic growth right here. Notice how I'm just taking a short phrase or a few words from there. Look at the next paragraph here. The irony of the current situation is that India was once considered to be overeducated. Very interesting. I'm going to put once considered overeducated. All right. Same thing here. Since the Second World War, the countries that have made successful leaps from developing to developed status have all poured money, public and private, into education. Okay, I'm just going to call this money and education. You see how we're just actively mind mapping this? Now, I'm just reading the first sentences, but if you were reading this, you would do this after each paragraph for the read and recall strategy. Same thing over here. Last sentence of the last paragraph. India has taken tentative steps to remedy its skills famine. The current government has made noises about doubling spending on education, and a host of new colleges and universities have sprung up since the mid-1990s. Same thing. This is basically, they're talking about a remedy / solutions, and we mind map. These are just basic ideas, all of these things here. And of course, if you wanted to add some details to any of these, you can easily do that like this, right? Very easy to add. And then you end up having a mind map of this right here. So this is how you would apply the read and recall strategy. Again, you read a paragraph, take a quick note, just a word or a short phrase. Doesn't have to be, entire sentences. I want to go over how to deal with diagrams and charts, because this is a common problem that pops up while you're reading. Every so often you might get a formula, a chart, or a diagram that you've got to analyze. Maybe you got to take some notes on it, or just got to figure out what's going on here. So here's what I suggest you do. Most people, what they do is, they see a diagram like this that pops up on the page. At some point on another page or the same page, they're reading about that diagram and they're saying figure 2.4 shows the relationship between blah, blah, blah and blah, blah, blah. And it also shows this and that. And they give you all this detail. And then they look at the diagram and they're like, I have no clue what's going on here. So they have to reread the paragraph again. Here's what I suggest you do instead. You're reading through the paragraph, and the moment that it says refer to figure 2.4, you stop for a moment and look at 2.4 just for a first impression. Okay? So for my first impression here, I see a human body. Over here, I'd be like, all right, this is like a flow chart. These two things would pop off the page for me initially. This right here, I see something very complex. So that would just be my first impression. I see a lot of different colored lines. I wonder what those are. Now, we've just read one sentence. It might have said figure 2.4 shows It might say refer to figure 2.4. I'll look at it, and then I'll read the next sentence, and it might say figure 2.4 shows the relationship between blah 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 and blah blah blah. I'll stop reading at that point, and I will analyze the diagram to see if I can visually confirm what they just said. And usually that simplifies the process. When we have a very complex diagram, as you see right here, if they told me, look at the green line, okay, I got it. It shows this. Okay, that makes sense. The next sentence might say, all right, now I want you to look at the red line. Okay, the red line shows this. Okay, that makes sense. So you're kind of going bit by bit when you're going through these kinds of paragraphs. So I suggest you read a sentence, visually confirm it with the diagram or the chart or the formula. Read another sentence, visually confirm it. And have you ever heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words? I'm sure you have. Think about how much it aids your comprehension when you could see something visually. It helps tremendously. So you want to make sure that you're kind of reading. It's kind of a choppy way of reading, but it will help your comprehension tremendously. Now, when you go back to regular reading where you're just going with the flow after they stop referring to the diagram, but this is how you would approach diagrams, charts, or maybe a formula while you're reading. Other situations while you're reading where you might have to take notes. When you get new vocabulary, technical terms, you might have to memorize those terms. So, what if you had a word like this? Extremely long word. This, by the way, the definition of this word, believe it or not, this is the fear of long words. It's a phobia. Now, let's say we had a new vocabulary word, and here's the thing. Vocabulary can be hard to remember because it's abstract information. You know what's easier for the human mind to remember? Visual information. That's very easy to remember. I'll give you an example. This is easy to remember. If I took it away and asked you, what did you see? You'd be like, okay, there was a blue sky. Maybe you remember the lake. There was a house, a little pathway over here, green grass. Visual information is very easy to remember. Now, you might not remember every single detail here, but you can generally remember this. When you have to remember vocabulary, it's a little more difficult, as you can see here. The word conterminous. That's a little harder to remember. There's not really a visual reference for this immediately available. And this idea of abstract versus visual reminds me of something called the Baker-Baker paradox. This is really interesting stuff. They've done this study numerous times, and here's what they do. They show people a picture, or they're introduced to someone named Mr. Baker. Now, they are asked a few days later if they could remember what that person's name was, and most people forget the person's name because during the study, they're not actually telling people that they're testing them to see if they could remember the name. They fake the experiment and they test them on something. They pretend to test them on something else. But what they really want to see is how many people can remember this guy's name. Most people forget, like 90% forget. Now, the funny thing is they take an entirely separate group and they're introduced to the same person, either in person or by photograph. And this time, this group is told something different. Not that the person's name is Mr. Baker, but instead that this person is a baker. I am a baker. That's my occupation. Okay. A few days later, they test these people to see, can you remember what this person does for a living? And most people remember. They remember, oh yeah, that was the person you said they were a baker. Why is it? This is why they call it the Baker-Baker paradox. And it's really not a paradox, but they call it a paradox because we've got the same word here, baker, and it's just used in two different contexts. In one context, it's very easy to forget. In another context, it's very easy to remember. Why? Because there's a different amount of remembering going on when you tell someone that, this person is a baker. How do you picture a baker visually? What kind of references do you have? You might picture, a baker's hat, right? Kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, or you might picture like an apron or flour on their hands. It might make you think of bread. When you're told someone's name is Mr. Baker, you don't have any visual reference for that. So not as many connections get hit up in your brain. Now, this is very important because we're going to use this idea and this knowledge to help ourselves remember new vocabulary. And you could do it with something called the similar sound technique. Let me explain how the similar sound technique works and how it's going to help you remember new vocabulary. And this could be even if you're dealing with, new vocabulary in, let's say you're trying to learn a foreign language. I'll give you an example. Claustrophobia. You know what this word means. I'm guessing you do. This is the fear of closed spaces. But you already knew that. Let's say you didn't know that. Let's say we're trying to explain this to someone, like a little kid, maybe a younger brother or sister, or a boy or girl that you have. Claustrophobia. How would you teach them this? With the similar sound technique, you look for a similar sound that they would be able to associate to. In this situation, we might look at claws, and a little kid might make the reference from, claws to what it sounds like Santa Claus. Now, that's just a similar sound, like a hook to the word claus. We're going to associate that to Santa Claus. Next thing we have to do is combine Santa Claus in a visual way, imagine something, with the definition. This is a fear of closed spaces. So we have to visualize something with Santa Claus and a fear of closed spaces. And by the way, the more ridiculous you make these images in your mind, the better. So you might imagine Santa Claus being stuck inside of a chimney, and he is afraid of tight chimney spaces or closed spaces like a chimney. And if you imagine something like this, or you ask a little kid to imagine this, what's going to happen next time they're presented with this word? They're going to remember, they're going to hook into claustrophobia, claus, they'll remember Santa Claus, and then they'll remember that ridiculous image of Santa Claus being afraid of closed, tight chimney spaces. And then, of course, they'll remember, oh yeah, this is the fear of closed spaces. And hopefully they remember that rather than the fear of Santa Claus. It's probably a separate phobia. Let's take another phobia. This is something you probably aren't familiar with. Balloon phobia. Do you know what this word means? Balloon phobia? Without Googling it? Most people don't. It's not as common as claustrophobia. This is the fear of needles. How are we going to remember it? We look for a similar sound. Now, I'm focusing on this part because you probably already know that phobia means the fear of. Let's focus here. Balloon. Now, we could see similar sounds here, like be alone. It doesn't have to be exact, like be alone, or bologna, like bologna, the deli meat. Or even like balloon. Now, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. That's why they call it the similar sound technique. Now, we're trying to hook into something that has a similar sound that we can visualize in our head. Why? Because we remember visual information very easily. Now, we have to hook back to the fear of needles. That's the definition. Now, we have a few options here. You could either go with the option of be alone, or baloney, or balloon. We have to hook back to fear of needles. I don't know about you, but I'm going to go with the balloon. So I'm going to imagine a balloon, and the balloon is afraid of a needle or needles coming towards it. So you can actually imagine a balloon that's sweating and screaming for help because all these needles are coming towards it. Now, we're fully aware that balloons have no sense of emotion, but if you can imagine something that's out of the ordinary or exaggerated, it actually helps you remember the information better. So later on, if you see this word, balloon phobia, you'll remember balloon phobia. Oh yeah, the balloon was afraid of needles, the fear of needles. You see how that works? Let's take another one, anthrophobia. This is actually the fear of people. Fear of people. You could have gotten that from anthro, like anthropology, but what if you didn't make that connection? There's also the similar sound of ant over here, like the insect. You could imagine maybe, you might picture in your mind ants afraid of people stepping on them. So you would actually want to imagine this and visualize it to the detail. A bunch of ants running around, being afraid of people, footsteps crashing upon them, and they're afraid of people stepping on them. And when you see this word again, anthrophobia, you'll remember, oh yeah, ant. It has a sound ant in it. What were the ants afraid of? The fear of people, right? So you see how this works, and you can continue. This is actually a word in Spanish. This word means boat in Spanish. How would you remember it? Well, we have the sound bark. You also have the sound bar in there. But bark, when I see, this is, could be bark of a tree, or it could be the bark of a dog. I would maybe imagine a dog in a boat that is stranded at sea, and it's barking for help. So I would imagine a dog in the middle of a boat, and it's just floating around, stranded at sea, and it's barking. And that'll remind you, when you see this word again in the future, barco, you'll remember, oh yeah, you'll link bark to boat, because you imagine that dog being stranded at sea inside of a boat. So you can do this with foreign languages, new words that you come across. It's also important to write the words down. This webinar is about note-taking, so writing things down will help you remember. But if you could utilize this similar sound technique, that will help you remember the information even more effectively. So if you ever get a word like this, even a long word like this, we see, a similar sound right here immediately, like hippo. How can you visualize that in a crazy way that'll help you remember the fear of long words? Now, one way that I would, remember this is just an extremely long word, so it kind of, it's easy to remember, but anytime you have a similar sound, try to link it to something you can visualize. So I hope you guys get the idea, because images are very, very simple to remember. And you can utilize the similar sound technique to turn sounds into things you could visualize and then associate back to the meaning. So, do you still remember what balloonphobia means? Do you still remember what anthrophobia means? Do you still remember what barco means? It's easier when you find those similar sounds and associate them. So, just to recap what we've gone over so far, taking notes helps us to improve our focus and also our memory. You want to, if you lose your concentration very easily, you definitely want to take notes. And you want to take notes in a visual way, because a lot of information, it doesn't have to be in a very specific order. Creating mind maps is a great way to visually associate your information. And follow the 80-20 principle, so you're not taking notes too often. If you take them, if you're spending half your time taking notes and half your time reading, that's way too much time spent note taking, and you're going to feel like it takes forever to get through a chapter. And of course, we talked about the similar sound technique if you encounter new vocabulary. Now, one other thing I want to mention before we get going here is that if you're in one of the following cities, or if you want to see a class in person in one of the cities, we're in all of these cities, and you can see other cities on this link right here. If you just go to irisreading.com and click on live courses, you'll find all the cities where we do classes if you want to attend something in person. Or if we're not in your city, you can invite us to your school or company. I've got my contact information. It's just paul@irisreading.com. I'll have my contact information at the end of this webinar as well. There's also a free app that we have on Android and also on the iPhone and iPad. It's called Speed Reading Tips. And if you're looking for more information on retention, comprehension, and also boosting your reading speed, there's a lot of great tips in this application. If you want to optimize your reading speed and your comprehension and also your memory, we have a series of webinars that we did not too long ago that covers this. It's actually a 10-part series, and I thought you might be interested. If you go to irisreading.com/special, we have a special offer for people that have watched this webinar. The first webinar in this series is just called Speed Reading Fundamentals and Advanced Techniques. Go over is not just fundamental information, but advanced ways of improving your reading speed. The second webinar in the series is how to remember more of what you read. Note-taking is a part of that, but there are some other strategies you can implement to remember things more effectively. There's also how to remember names more easily. If you're interested in improving your ability to remember people's names, I think all of us have had that awkward situation where we forget someone's name almost instantly upon meeting them. This will help you to remember those names. The fourth webinar in this series is how to remember vocabulary. There's another webinar, how to remember a presentation without notes. Email management, how to read your email faster. Most people haven't really been taught how to get through email very efficiently. This webinar goes over some best practices and some things to avoid when you're getting through your email. There's another webinar in the series, how to remember passwords. All of us have to do that. Equations and important dates. How to remember long lists of information is webinar 8 in the series. Number 9 is mnemonic devices, how to make them work for you. And number 10 is how to concentrate better while reading. And that's a big part of improving your reading speed. If you can't focus, it doesn't matter if you're going really slow or really fast. If you don't have the concentration, you're going to forget everything. You're not going to remember what you just read. And if you're interested in this webinar, we also have a bonus in the webinar. It's called Speed Reading Strategies for Tests. So if you're preparing for the ACT, SAT, or one of the graduate level exams like the GRE, MCAT, GMAT, LSAT, this webinar goes over speed reading strategies that apply to the reading portions of those tests. Now, when we did this webinar series, each webinar was $25. So the total package is worth $250. You can get all 10 of these webinars for $50. It's a package deal. If you're interested in it, go to irisreading.com/special, and it's for a limited time. So check that out when you get a chance. As I mentioned before, you can invite us to your company or school if you're interested in a live in-person course. Just feel free to contact me. And also, here's my contact information. If you do want to follow up by email, LinkedIn, Twitter, I want to thank you guys so much for attending the webinar, taking time out of your day. I hope you found it very helpful. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me by email, again, LinkedIn or Twitter. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. But thank you again so much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.